The room was cold, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. A dim light flickered overhead, casting shadows across the sterile white walls. She could hear the faint beeping of machines, a slow, rhythmic reminder of how little time she had left. Her body felt weak, frail, as if life itself was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the room, searching for the faces she had longed to see. But there was no one. No loving husband holding her hand, no child whispering words of comfort, no family standing by her side. She had given them everything, her youth, her dreams, her unwavering loyalty. And yet, in her final moments, she was nothing more than an afterthought, a burden they had discarded long before she took her last breath. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She had always believed in love, in sacrifice, in the idea that if she gave enough of herself, they would cherish her. But love had not saved her. Sacrifice had only left her empty. She had spent years bending, breaking, molding herself into the perfect wife, the perfect mother, only to be cast aside when she was no longer convenient. Her husband had stopped seeing her as a woman long ago. The warmth in his eyes had been replaced by cold indifference, and then by something even worse, contempt. She had ignored the signs at first, the way he stayed late at work, the way he smelled of perfume that was not hers. She had clung to denial, convincing herself that she was imagining things, that he still loved her. But the truth had been cruel, merciless. He had found someone else, someone younger, someone he did not have to pretend to love. And her child, the one she had carried, nurtured, loved with every fiber of her being, had turned against her too. He had grown to see her through his father's eyes, viewing her as weak, pitiful, someone to be tolerated rather than cherished. The harsh words, the cold stares, the way he spoke to her as if she was an inconvenience, it had all chipped away at her heart until there was nothing left. She closed her eyes, pain constricting her chest, though she was not sure if it was from the illness that had stolen her strength or from the unbearable ache of regret. If only she had chosen differently. If only she had not spent her life begging for love that was never meant for her. If only she had lived for herself, even once. The thought whispered through her mind, soft yet relentless. If only I could do it over again. If only I had another chance. A deep breath rattled in her chest, and then... nothing. Silence. Darkness. A feeling of weightlessness. As if she was floating in the vast emptiness of the universe. And then... gasp. Her eyes flew open, her lungs burning as she sucked in air. Panic surged through her veins as she sat up, her hands gripping the sheets beneath her. But these were not the crisp, sterile sheets of a hospital bed. They were soft, familiar. Her heart pounded wildly as she looked around, taking in the sight of the room around her. The floral-patterned wallpaper, the delicate lace curtains swaying in the breeze, the old wooden dresser filled with trinkets she had long forgotten. This was her bedroom. Not the cold, empty house she had left behind, but her room from years ago. She stumbled out of bed, her legs trembling as she rushed to the mirror. The reflection that stared back at her stole the breath from her lungs. She was young. The wrinkles, the tired, hollow eyes, the brittle gray hair, it was all gone. In their place was the face of a woman in her 20s, her skin smooth, her eyes full of a life she had once thought she had lost forever. A strangled laugh escaped her lips, followed by a sob. This was not a dream. This was real. Somehow, impossibly, she had been given another chance. And this time she would not make the same mistakes. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers trembling slightly as she traced the soft fabric of her nightgown. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. This was real. She was truly back in time. A slow, shuddering breath left her lips. She was no longer the broken woman lying on her deathbed, discarded and forgotten. The universe had given her a gift, a chance to undo the years of sacrifice and heartbreak that had led to her ruin. But she would not waste this opportunity. She refused to let herself become that woman again. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She turned her head, watching as the door opened and he walked in. Her husband. The man who had vowed to cherish her, to love and protect her, only to betray her in the most merciless way. He looked younger, his features not yet hardened by time and cruelty. But she knew what lay beneath the surface. "Are you not feeling well?" he asked, his voice laced with mild concern, though she knew it was nothing more than an empty habit. She studied him for a moment, her gaze unreadable. In her past life, she would have softened at his words, desperate for any scrap of affection he was willing to offer. But not this time. "I am fine," she replied simply, her tone cool and distant. Something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, perhaps even irritation. She had always been predictable, eager to please, willing to do anything to keep him happy. Her indifference unsettled him. He moved closer, reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, but she stood before he could. "I have some things to take care of today," she said, brushing past him without another word. She felt his stare on her back as she walked away, but she did not stop. For the first time in years, she felt a strange sense of power settle in her chest. As she moved through the house, memories flooded her mind. This home had once been her entire world. She had spent years perfecting it, ensuring that every detail was to his liking, believing that if she made everything perfect, he would love her the way she had loved him. What a foolish thought that had been. She paused in front of a mirror, taking in her own reflection once more. The woman who stared back at her was no longer desperate, no longer yearning for something she would never receive. This time she would not beg for love. At breakfast, her husband sat at the table as he always did, reading the newspaper as if the rest of the world did not exist. In the past, she would have served him quietly, taking care to make his coffee exactly the way he liked it. Instead, she sat down across from him, pouring only one cup for herself. He glanced up, frowning slightly. "You forgot my coffee." She met his gaze, unbothered. "I did not forget," she said, taking a sip from her own cup. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. He set the newspaper down, watching her with a look of scrutiny. Is something wrong? For the first time she truly saw him. Not as the man she had once loved, but as the man who had never truly valued her. There had been a time when his slightest frown would have sent her heart racing with fear, desperate to make things right. Now she only felt detachment. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "I simply realized that I have spent too much time worrying about others and too little time living for myself." His frown deepened, but before he could say anything else, she stood. "I have plans today. I will be out for most of the afternoon." "In the afternoon? Where are you going?" She turned her head slightly, offering a small, unreadable smile. "Somewhere important." She left him sitting there, confused and uneasy. It was the first of many shocks he would receive. She walked through the city streets with purpose, the familiar sights filling her with an odd sense of nostalgia. She had spent years trapped in a role she never truly wanted. Now she had a second chance to build something of her own. Her first stop was the bank. In her past life, she had trusted him with everything. Her finances, her security, her future. And in the end, he had used it all against her. That would not happen again. She met with an advisor, carefully listening as they discussed investments, savings, and financial independence. She opened an account in her name only, securing a portion of their shared funds before he had the chance to control it. Next, she sought out an opportunity to rebuild the dreams she had once abandoned. There had been a time when she had wanted a career, before she was convinced that a woman's place was at home, serving her family. That belief had only led to her destruction. Now she would reclaim what was hers. By the time she returned home, the sky had begun to darken, a soft orange glow settling over the horizon. As she stepped inside, she heard his voice from the living room. "Where have you been all day?" She turned to see him standing by the fireplace, arms crossed. His eyes filled with barely concealed irritation. In the past, she would have offered an explanation, eager to soothe any tension. But she owed him nothing. "I told you," she said simply. I had things to take care of. His jaw tightened. What kind of things? She met his gaze without fear. Personal matters. His frustration was evident, but she did not care. Let him be frustrated. Let him wonder. For the first time, he was the one feeling uncertain, and she found a quiet satisfaction in that. As she moved past him, she caught the flicker of something else in his expression. Unease. He had always been in control. She had always been the obedient wife, the one who followed without question. But now, something had shifted, and he did not know how to react. She stepped into her bedroom, closing the door behind her. As she leaned against it, a slow smile formed on her lips. This was only the beginning. She moved through the house with an air of quiet confidence, her presence no longer defined by the meek compliance that had once shaped her existence. The days of pleading for affection, of sacrificing her own desires for the comfort of others, were over. This time, she would not raise her voice in anger, nor would she confront them with accusations. Instead, she would dismantle their world piece by piece, so subtly that they would not even realize it was happening until it was far too late. Her husband had always believed himself untouchable. He had lived under the assumption that she would always be there, silently supporting him, financing his whims, tending to his needs while he gave his affection to another woman. He had taken her presence for granted, just as he had taken her resources without a second thought. But that was about to change. She visited the bank again, ensuring that more of their shared assets were redirected into an account under her name. She was careful, meticulous. The transfers were not large enough to raise immediate suspicion, but steady enough to build her financial independence. Every luxury he indulged in, his expensive suits, his impulsive investments, his unnecessary spending, had all been sustained by her silent sacrifices. Now, without realizing it, he was slowly bleeding dry. At home, she remained composed, offering no indication that anything had changed. If he noticed that his bank account was not as full as it once was, he would assume it was due to his own excessive spending. He had never been responsible with money, and for the first time, that weakness would work against him. She observed him closely, noting the first signs of frustration. A tense jaw when he checked his phone, a furrowed brow when he received a call from a business partner questioning a delayed payment. He did not bring these concerns to her, likely assuming he could fix the situation on his own. He had always seen himself as the dominant force in their relationship, the one in control. He would not easily accept the reality that his power was slipping. But it was not just financial control that she sought. She had spent years desperately trying to win the love of her child, pouring her soul into a bond that had only brought her pain. In her past life, she had begged for affection, believing that if she gave enough, her child would see her worth. But love was not something to be begged for. Now she did not plead. She did not chase. Instead, she let silence do the work for her. At first, her child barely noticed the shift. He had been used to her hovering presence, always ready to offer comfort, to smooth over conflicts, to take the blame even when it was not hers to bear. But now, when he dismissed her or spoke with cold indifference, she did not respond with disappointment or sadness. She simply carried on as if his words did not wound her. At the dinner table, when he barely acknowledged her, she remained unfazed, engaging in quiet conversation with others instead. When he needed something, she did not rush to provide it. She had been so eager to give him everything before, and now she only gave what she chose when she chose. The change unsettled him. He did not say it aloud, but she saw it in the way he hesitated before speaking, as if expecting a reaction that no longer came. She saw it in the way his gaze lingered on her when she laughed at something someone else had said, as if realizing for the first time that she existed outside of his perception of her. She knew it would take time. Love, once discarded, could not be reclaimed in a single moment. But she had patience now, and she understood something she had not before. People only valued what they believed they could lose. As the days passed, the cracks in her husband's carefully crafted world began to show. The woman he had chosen over her, The mistress he had lavished with gifts and promises, had always been drawn to power and security. The moment those things began to waver, so did her confidence in him. She overheard their conversations, the way her husband's voice grew tense as he tried to assure his mistress that everything was under control. She could hear the doubt creeping into the other woman's voice, the hesitation that had never been there before. The mistress had been so sure of her place, so certain that she had won. But now, as the foundation of her lover's success began to shake, she was realizing just how fragile her victory truly was. The first real sign of trouble came late one evening. Her husband had been out, likely with the woman he thought he loved. But when he returned, there was no satisfaction in his expression, no arrogance in his posture. He was tense, his hands clenched at his sides as he paced the living room. She watched from the doorway, silent and unnoticed. Finally, he exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. He had never been good at hiding his emotions when things did not go his way. She stepped into the room, and he looked up abruptly, as if only just realizing she was there. For a moment, there was hesitation in his eyes, as if he was debating whether or not to say something. "Did you need something?" she asked, her tone calm, unreadable. He studied her for a long moment, as if searching for the woman he had once known, the woman who would have tried to comfort him, to make things right. But she was gone. "No," he said finally, his voice tight. "It is nothing." She nodded, as if his answer was of little concern to her. "Good night, then." And with that, she left him standing there, alone with his unraveling world. She had known for weeks now. The hushed phone calls, the lingering scent of perfume that did not belong to her, the way he came home late with a poor excuse and an air of indifference. But unlike before, she did not allow herself to feel pain. There was no heartbreak, no sense of betrayal. Only quiet amusement at how predictable he was. Tonight was no different. He had left the house in a rush, barely bothering to give her an excuse this time. Perhaps he thought she had finally returned to being the wife who turned a blind eye, the woman who would always be waiting for him no matter what he did. He could not have been more wrong. She followed at a safe distance, her steps light, her heartbeat steady. The old version of her would have hesitated, would have dreaded the moment she would see him with the other woman. But now, she felt nothing but a strange sense of satisfaction. The hotel was an expensive one, a place for those who wished to indulge in secrets without fear of judgment. She had known he would be here. He was predictable, always choosing convenience over discretion. She walked through the lobby with ease, her presence unnoticed by those around her. The receptionist barely looked up as she made her way to the elevator, pressing the button with steady fingers. When she reached the door, she did not hesitate. A single knock, firm and unyielding. There was a pause. She imagined the two of them inside, frozen in place, fear creeping into their veins as they realized that whoever was on the other side of the door was not supposed to be there. Then footsteps, a hesitant turn of the handle, and finally, her husband's face, wide-eyed, panic flickering in his expression. Behind him, his mistress clutched the bedsheets, her face pale as she realized the inevitable had come much sooner than expected. For a moment, silence stretched between them. He opened his mouth, perhaps to stammer out an excuse, but before he could, she did something none of them expected. She laughed. A genuine, amused, almost delighted laugh. It was light, effortless, as if she had just heard an entertaining joke rather than walked in on her husband betraying her. His face twisted in confusion, his mouth opening and closing as if he could not quite grasp what was happening. His mistress, still frozen in place, looked between them with growing unease. She took a step inside, crossing her arms as she gazed at them with mild curiosity. "You thought I did not know?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "You truly believed I was that blind?" Her husband swallowed, finding his voice at last. It is not what it looks like." She laughed again, shaking her head. "Do not embarrass yourself further," she said smoothly. "I have known for weeks." "No," she corrected herself. I have known for much longer than that. I simply did not care." He flinched as if she had struck him. She could see it now, the moment he realized she was no longer the woman he thought he could manipulate. His mistress, who had once worn an air of smug confidence, was shrinking back, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "You," he began, but she held up a hand, silencing him effortlessly. "I have been preparing for this moment for quite some time," she said. "Did you truly believe I would allow myself to be humiliated twice in the same lifetime?" His brows furrowed, confusion mixing with fear. "What are you talking about?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You will understand soon enough." With that, she turned on her heel and left, her steps calm and measured. She did not need to see his reaction. She had already set everything in motion. The night of the gala arrived swiftly. It was a high-profile event, one her husband had always used to flaunt his status, to remind others of his power and influence. But this year would be different. This year he would not be the one in control. She walked into the grand hall, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. The air buzzed with conversation, laughter, the clinking of glasses. And then, as the moment arrived, she stepped forward, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, drawing every eye in the room to her. "Tonight is a special evening, a celebration of success, of ambition, of integrity. And it is only right that we acknowledge those who have worked so hard to build such an image." She let the words hang for a moment before her gaze settled on her husband. He had gone pale, his hands tightening around the glass he held. "Unfortunately," she continued, "not all successes are as noble as they appear." A hush fell over the room. Murmurs began to rise, curious glances darting between her and her husband. She saw his mistress in the crowd, her face drained of color, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as she realized what was coming. With a simple gesture, the large screen behind her came to life. Images flashed, receipts, messages, hotel bookings, undeniable proof of his infidelity. Gasps echoed through the hall. Her husband shot to his feet, his face contorted in rage and humiliation. "You," he began, but she merely smiled, her expression one of quiet triumph. "Consider this my farewell gift," she said smoothly, her voice carrying through the stunned silence. The fallout was immediate. His business partners distanced themselves. His friends, the ones who had praised him for years, whispered behind his back. The media latched onto the scandal with a hunger that would not fade easily. And his mistress, the woman who had once been so sure of her place in his life, began to retreat. She had never been in this for love. She had been drawn to the wealth, the power, the status. And now, as all of that began to crumble, she was already planning her escape. As she walked out of the event, she felt something she had not felt in years: freedom. He had never thought much about her absence before. For as long as he could remember, she had always been there, silent, patient, willing to forgive, no matter how many times he pushed her away. She had given without question, loved without conditions, and endured without complaint. And because of that, he had assumed she always would. But now something had changed. First, it had been subtle. She stopped waiting for him at the dinner table, her eyes no longer searching for his approval. She no longer asked about his day, no longer tried to bridge the distance between them with soft words and unwavering support. He had barely noticed it then, believing it to be nothing more than a passing mood. But as days turned to weeks, the shift became undeniable. She was no longer waiting for him. For the first time, he found himself watching her instead of the other way around. And what he saw unsettled him. She was thriving. He saw it in the way she carried herself, in the way she spoke, in the way others now looked at her with admiration and respect. She had built something for herself, a life outside of the role she had once played as his mother. She had laughter in her voice, confidence in her stride, and an ease that had never been there before. And worst of all, she did not need him. The realization sat heavy in his chest. He tried to ignore it at first, convincing himself that it did not matter. She was just his mother, and mothers were always supposed to be there, no matter what. But then the world around him started shifting in ways he did not expect. His father, once a figure of authority and power, had become a source of disgrace. The scandal that had unfolded left him disgraced, abandoned by the very people who had once sung his praises. Without wealth and influence, his friends disappeared one by one, leaving him to face the consequences of his own downfall. And the mistress, the woman who had once worn a smug smile, so sure of her place, was gone. She had vanished the moment she realized that the man she had attached herself to was no longer capable of offering her the life she had expected. It was as if everything he had once taken for granted was crumbling around him. Even his own friends, the ones he had surrounded himself with, started slipping away. They had been there when things were easy, when he carried the status of his father's name, when he had been able to push others down with nothing more than a cold glance and a sharp word. But now, when his name no longer carried the same weight, they began to distance themselves. One betrayal after another. One loss after another. And yet, through it all, she remained untouched. His mother, the woman he had ignored, dismissed, even resented, had not only survived without him, she had flourished. He did not understand it at first. How could she be happy without them? Without him? Had she never needed him in the first place? Had she always been capable of standing on her own, even when he had believed her to be weak? The questions burned in his mind, each one leaving behind an uncomfortable truth he did not want to face. And then, for the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar. Regret. He thought back to all the time she had reached for him, all the time she had put him first, all the time she had swallowed her own pain just to make sure he was comfortable. And he had never once thanked her. He had assumed she would always be there, always waiting, always ready to forgive. But now she was not waiting anymore. The realization terrified him. Desperation crept in slowly, manifesting in small, hesitant attempts to reach out. He started lingering in rooms she occupied, hoping she would acknowledge him first. He tried to speak to her, only to find that the words did not come as easily as they once had. And when he did finally manage to say something, anything, her responses were polite but distant, no longer filled with warmth, no longer filled with the quiet, unwavering love he had once taken for granted. He had spent his whole life believing he was the one who had the power to decide when and how they spoke. But now she was the one in control, and he was the one left behind. The thought sent a strange ache through him, one that he did not know how to soothe. For the first time, he wondered if he had lost her forever. She had imagined freedom once. Back when she had been trapped in a loveless marriage. Back when her world had revolved around people who only took and never gave. But the reality of it was far sweeter than she had ever dreamed. She was no longer the woman who had once begged for scraps of affection, no longer the wife who had endured in silence, no longer the mother who had sacrificed every part of herself for a child who never looked back. Now she was something else entirely. A woman of her own making. She walked through the city with ease, no longer weighed down by the past. Every step she took was her own. Every decision she made belonged only to her. And for the first time in her life she was truly happy. It was during one of these quiet moments of contentment that she met him. He was nothing like her husband. Where her husband had been cold and entitled, this man was warm and respectful. Where her husband had seen her as something to control, he saw her as something to admire. He spoke to her like she mattered, like her thoughts and opinions were worth something. She had not expected to love again. She had not even thought she would want to. But love, it seemed, had found her anyway. And unlike before, this time, she did not lose herself in it. She remained her own person, strong and independent, and he cherished her for it. There was no fear, no insecurity, no need to constantly prove her worth. She was simply herself. And that was enough. She did not think of the past often anymore, but when it came knocking, she was prepared. Her husband's downfall had been slow and painful. The loss of wealth, the loss of reputation, The slow realization that the world did not pity him. It had stripped him of the arrogance he once wore so proudly. And now, standing before her, he was nothing more than a broken man. He looked older, worn down by failure and regret. His voice, once filled with authority, was now uncertain, hesitant. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his tone careful, as if hoping she would offer him an easy way out. "But you were my wife. You stood by me once. Can we not put the past behind us?" She let the silence stretch between them, watching as he shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. There was a time when she would have forgiven him. A time when she would have let his words manipulate her into believing there was still something worth saving. But that time had long passed. She gave him a single glance, cold, unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. There was nothing left to say. His mistress fared no better. She had always thought herself clever, always believed she was the one who had won. But betrayal, it seemed, had a way of coming full circle. She had left her husband the moment his power faded, running straight into the arms of another man who promised her the life she thought she deserved. But she had made the mistake of believing that love built on greed could ever last. Her new lover discarded her just as easily as she had discarded others before. And now she stood alone, bitter and humiliated, forced to face the same emptiness she had once inflicted on others. The sweetest revenge, the MC realized, was never rage or cruelty. It was indifference. But there was one last thing to settle. Her child. He came to her one evening, no longer the arrogant, careless boy he once was. His shoulders slumped. His voice filled with something she had never heard from him before. Genuine regret. "I was wrong," he said, the words slow, as if they were foreign to him. "I was wrong about everything." She said nothing. "I know I do not deserve your forgiveness," he continued. "I do not expect you to welcome me back. But please, do not hate me." She took in his expression, the way his hands clenched at his sides, the way he refused to meet her gaze out of shame. She had spent years chasing after his love, breaking herself apart just to make him happy. And now, when she had finally stopped, he was the one standing before her, asking for another chance. Poetic, really. She exhaled slowly, allowing herself a moment to consider. She did not forgive easily anymore. And she certainly would not do it just because he suddenly realized what he had lost. So she let him suffer a little longer. Not out of cruelty, but because, for the first time in his life, he needed to learn what it felt like to fight for something real. She sat in silence, watching the world move outside her window. The city stretched beyond her, lights flickering like distant stars, life continuing without hesitation. It was peaceful, this quiet moment, a stark contrast to the chaos she had once lived in. Her child had come again. She had not given him an answer the first time, or the second, and still he returned, waiting for something he was no longer sure he would receive. She knew he had changed. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by loss and hardship. His voice no longer carried the sharp edge of entitlement, but the softer weight of regret. He did not demand, did not expect. He simply waited. And she, for the first time, truly allowed herself to think. Forgiveness was not something to be given lightly. She had spent too many years offering her love unconditionally, only to be cast aside like she was nothing. That woman no longer existed. Now she understood something she never had before. Love was not something to be taken for granted. It was not a duty or an obligation. It was a choice. And she, for once in her life, held the power to make that choice for herself. She turned the thought over in her mind, weighing it carefully. She could let him back in. Could allow the past to be rewritten. Could try again with the boy who had once thought so little of her. Or she could walk away, leaving him to learn that some wounds did not heal just because someone wanted them to. He stood before her now, silent, waiting. She met his eyes, searching for something, though she was not sure what. Would it be enough? Could he truly understand what he had done? She let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of uncertainty, let him wonder if he had already lost her forever. And then, at last, she spoke. "Love is earned," she said, her voice steady, certain. "It is not given freely, not when it has been discarded so easily before." He flinched but did not look away. "You will not have my forgiveness just because you ask for it," she continued. "You will have to prove yourself. Not with words but with actions. And even then, I will decide if it is enough." She could see the emotions flickering across his face. Relief, sadness, determination. For the first time he understood. She did not promise him anything, did not assure him of a future where everything would be as it once was. That world was gone. But she had given him a chance. And if he truly wanted to be part of her life again, he would have to fight for it. It was enough. Later that night, she stepped out onto her balcony, the cool air brushing against her skin. She felt lighter, as if something had finally settled inside her. She had made her choice. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Her life was no longer defined by the people who had once hurt her. She had built something new, something stronger. Wealth, independence, love. These things were hers, not because someone gave them to her, but because she had fought for them. She had been reborn not to seek revenge, but to reclaim herself. And now, standing here, with everything she had worked for finally within her grasp, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had won.